woman wakes up in the recovery room after a routine, scheduled surgery, relieved that the procedure was a success. She did everything right, meticulously verifying that her hospital and her lead surgeon were fully covered by her health insurance network. Yet weeks later, a devastating envelope arrives in the mail demanding thousands of dollars in unexpected charges. The anesthesiologist who kept her alive during the operation was out of network, triggering a financial catastrophe. This is not an administrative glitch, but a deliberate corporate mechanism. This scenario explains the systemic cause of surprise anesthesia bills that have financially ruined countless American families over the past 2 decades. Millions of patients walk into operating rooms believing they are financially protected, only to be ambushed by predatory invoices while they are literally unconscious and unable to consent. The anesthesiology department, once a deeply integrated and collaborative wing of the community hospital, has been quietly transformed into a highly optimized engine for wealth extraction. The architects of this transformation do not wear white coats, but rather bespoke suits in Wall Street boardrooms. Over the last 20 years, massive private equity firms like KKR and Blackstone identified a profound vulnerability in the architecture of hospital care. Anesthesia is a non-negotiable service. A patient suffering a ruptured appendix cannot pause an emergency surgery to negotiate rates or shop around for a cheaper doctor. This entirely captive audience made the specialty an incredibly lucrative target. To capture this market, these financial titans deployed a ruthless corporate strategy known as a roll-up. They created massive corporate entities, systematically buying up independent, locally owned physician groups one by one and merging them into sprawling national conglomerates. By consolidating anesthesiology practices across entire regions, these private equity firms amassed unprecedented, monopolistic market power, allowing them to dictate terms to both hospitals and major insurance carriers with absolute impunity. Once regional dominance was firmly established, the true financial engineering began in earnest. The newly formed corporate behemoths would deliberately and strategically terminate their existing contracts with major insurance providers. By intentionally pulling their massive networks of doctors out of the insurance networks, they completely freed themselves from standard negotiated rate caps, allowing them to charge exponentially higher fees for the exact same medical services. The mechanics of this out-of-network strategy relied entirely on the inherent chaos of hospital billing and patient vulnerability. You choose an in-network facility and an in-network surgeon, but the corporate-owned anesthesia provider standing at the head of your operating table operates under a completely separate, unregulated billing structure. The resulting invoice, often double or triple the standard negotiated rate, is aggressively pursued and sent directly to the unsuspecting patient. The human cost of these surprise bills is staggering, often pushing stable households to the brink of bankruptcy. A family welcoming a new child via cesarean section suddenly faces a $4,500 charge for a routine epidural, instantly wiping out their carefully managed savings. The profound physical and emotional trauma of a major medical event is immediately compounded by sudden, aggressive corporate debt collection tactics that offer no mercy. Beyond the aggressive billing practices, the corporate takeover drastically altered fundamental physician staffing models inside the operating room. To maximize their profit margins and satisfy investor demands, private equity owners began systematically replacing highly paid, board-certified anesthesiologists with lower-cost, mid-level practitioners. The traditional, careful balance of medical expertise was fundamentally re-engineered, shifting the focus from optimal patient safety to maximizing the daily volume of billable procedures. The shadow of that strategy still loomed over every new acquisition, fundamentally changing the daily reality for medical staff. Doctors who once carefully managed 1 or 2 complex surgical cases simultaneously were suddenly mandated by corporate executives to supervise 4, 5, or even 6 operating rooms at once. The relentless pressure to maintain this grueling, high-volume pace forced seasoned medical professionals into impossible ethical binds, compromising the very safety protocols they were sworn to uphold. Medical researchers and patient safety advocates have raised urgent alarms about this aggressive restructuring of the operating theater. When the ratio of supervising physicians to active surgical tables is stretched to the absolute breaking point, the critical margin for error effectively vanishes. A sudden, catastrophic drop in a patient's blood pressure or an unexpected airway complication requires immediate, highly specialized intervention that a thinly stretched supervisor simply cannot provide in time. Lawmakers eventually attempted to shield the public from these predatory billing practices after massive public outcry. The federal government introduced the No Surprises Act, legislation specifically designed to ban surprise medical billing, forcing out-of-network providers and insurers to negotiate directly between themselves rather than ambushing the patient. It was initially heralded by advocates as a massive, long-overdue victory for fundamental consumer protection in healthcare. However, the corporate conglomerates had already anticipated this legislative hurdle and prepared their countermeasures. They lobbied fiercely to shape the binding arbitration process that replaced the surprise bills, ensuring the new system heavily favored their historical, artificially inflated rates. The crushing financial burden was not eliminated. It was merely shifted from direct, visible patient invoices into higher overall insurance premiums that quietly drained the pockets of every American family. Hospitals themselves became deeply complicit in this silent takeover, prioritizing their own balance sheets over patient welfare. Desperate to cut their own rising overhead costs, hospital administrators happily outsourced their entire anesthesia departments to these private equity-backed firms, signing exclusive contracts. In doing so, they traded the long-term financial security and physical safety of their patients for a convenient, short-term reduction in their own administrative budgets. The underlying engine driving this relentless nationwide expansion is a financial maneuver known as a leveraged buyout. Private equity firms purchase these vital medical groups using massive amounts of borrowed money, and then immediately transfer that staggering debt directly onto the balance sheet of the newly acquired medical practice. The doctors are suddenly working exhausting hours just to pay off the high-interest loans used to buy their own practice. To extract immediate, massive cash returns, the firms often execute a ruthless tactic called a dividend recapitalization. They force the already heavily indebted medical practice to borrow even more money from Wall Street lenders, using the new loan to pay a massive tax-advantaged cash payout directly to the private equity investors. The investors walk away incredibly rich, while the healthcare provider is left teetering on the edge of total insolvency. The consequences of this extreme debt loading inevitably bleed directly into the patient care experience. When a medical practice must dedicate a massive portion of its daily revenue strictly to servicing corporate debt, it cannot invest in advanced monitoring equipment, continuing medical education, or adequate nursing support staff. The physical environment of care begins to visibly deteriorate, leaving patients vulnerable in outdated, understaffed facilities. Financial analysts point out that this specific corporate model relies entirely on relentless growth and extreme cost-cutting just to survive its own debt. The primary metric of success is no longer patient survival rates or reduced complication metrics, but strictly defined EBITDA, which stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. Life-saving healthcare is effectively reduced to a pure, mathematically cold extraction exercise designed to enrich distant shareholders. Antitrust regulators remained completely blind to this creeping monopoly for years, failing to protect the public. Because the acquisitions were made through dozens of small, localized purchases rather than massive, headline-grabbing mega-mergers, they easily flew under the radar of federal scrutiny. The Federal Trade Commission simply did not have the regulatory framework or the resources to track and stop these insidious, localized micro-monopolies before they dominated entire regional healthcare markets. The profound moral injury inflicted on the remaining medical staff cannot be overstated. Veteran anesthesiologists report crippling levels of burnout, describing their modern working environments as chaotic assembly lines where meaningful patient interaction is reduced to a frantic 3-minute pre-operative interview. The sacred, historical trust between doctor and patient is violently severed by corporate mandates that view human beings strictly as billable commodities. This aggressive consolidation of anesthesiology is just one highly profitable front in a much larger, ongoing war for total control of American healthcare. The ruthless financial tactics perfected in the operating room are now being rapidly deployed in emergency departments, dermatology clinics, and pediatric centers across the entire nation. The fundamental architecture of medical care is being quietly rewritten to serve private capital rather than public health. The firms driving this radical transformation operate with intentional, heavily guarded opacity. By hiding their true ownership behind complex webs of shell companies, regional brand names, and subsidiary holding groups, they effectively shield themselves from public accountability and devastating malpractice lawsuits. A patient suffering from a botched intubation or a life-altering financial ambush rarely, if ever, knows the name of the Wall Street firm ultimately responsible for their suffering. The quiet commodification of our most vulnerable moments demands urgent, unyielding public scrutiny. When the delicate act of keeping a human being safely unconscious during major surgery is transformed into a highly leveraged financial instrument, the entire ethical foundation of medicine collapses. The true, lasting cost of this corporate takeover is measured not just in surprise bills but in the slow, systemic erosion of patient trust and human life.